took the guns. Stalin took the guns. Mao took the guns. Fidel Castro took the guns. Hugo Chavez took the guns. And I'm here to tell you, 1776 will commence again if you try to take our firearms. Doesn't matter how many lemmings you get out there on the street begging for them to have their guns taken. We will not relinquish them. Do you understand?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Liberty Revolt, www.libertyrevoltmedia.com, facebook.com/Liberty Revolt Media. It's no surprise to anyone following the social movements that revolutionary thought is brimming across this country, and the Western world more broadly. The talk of radical change is rampant, and people are beginning to take to the streets more and more often, triggered more easily and frequently, and growing more violent and emboldened. Unfortunately, they seem profoundly ignorant to history broadly, ignorant to the story of the progress of America, and absolutely ignorant to the strategies or lack thereof that has made revolutions in the past effective and beneficial to society, or chaotic and destructive to society. Of course, the facts surrounding these triggering events are often debatable, and our role of the free press is often as a politically driven agitator. These politicians and media entities stoking this movement apparently don't realize that the revolutionaries are no doubt going to eat them first. Our goal for today is to explore the profound revolutions of the past and compare them to each other and the movements we are seeing in our society today. We are joined today by our co-patriot Kevin, the president of the Colorado chapter of Turning Point USA, a conservative campus outreach group that has been sounding the alarm for some time.
Yeah, welcome to the show, everybody. We just kind of want to go over and give everybody a flavor of different revolutions throughout history and how they've worked, especially socialist revolutions, or more poignantly, revolutions without a plan. And I think you could see that revolutions without a plan and without leaders end up enshrining the worst of revolutionary values known to man.
Yeah, in my own personal experience, going through this, looking through the past, looking through especially the 20th century, and all the kind of, cultural revolutions that came with it. You look at, obviously the Bolshevik Revolution in China, you had Mao. You've seen it more recently in places like Venezuela, in places like Korea, but at the end of the day, they all have the similarities of movements inspired by people that at the end of the day, there's no stability. The stability is not the end goal in a lot of these revolutions. A lot of these revolutions are based almost entirely around somehow, some way, seizing power that has been used that you think oppresses you, and rather than figuring out a way to remove that oppressive force, to fix the oppression that it brings with it, it's how can I use this oppressive force for my own gain?
So while the American Revolution is considered a pretty good thing, to most of us at least, the French Revolution is often seen as a bloody mess, because it was.
Yeah.
Although its ideas changed human history almost more than any other revolution in history, uplifting progressive ideals, the French Revolution would do an exceptionally poor job of accomplishing this. Like a lot of revolutions, it sacrificed a shocking number of its own people, including the leaders and allies of the revolution, and in the end, it exchanged an authoritarian regime for an even more dominant authoritarian regime. So where did it go wrong? Edmund Burke, considered the forefather of conservative philosophy, attempted to explain this when he wrote the famous Reflections on the Revolution in France in 1790, in which he was able to predict with surprising accuracy what would happen 9 years prior to the end of the revolution. The basic philosophy was that revolutionaries go wrong when they disregard their traditions and suddenly and violently upend the political structures and foundations of society. He wasn't opposed to progressive change, but he contended that there was a stability and a silent wisdom that was passed down through the generations and embedded in our societal structures, and that changes should be made incrementally with time allotted to measure the consequences. He believed that by imposing radical upheavals too suddenly and without regard for traditions, it would become destabilizing, lending itself to mass violence and chaos, which would lend itself to a counter-progressive tyranny. That's what he saw in France, and that's what I see going on today.
Well, the difference is in France, if you look at the absolutist government of Louis XIV, he ruled France with an iron fist, he made it rich, but he consolidated all the power for himself. And, when you give that to sort of a leader like Louis XV and then Louis XVI who are incompetent, then you can see the state falling and you can see the reason for a revolution. Now, even with this reasonable revolution coming in the French sense, it still failed, it still created violence, and it still heralded a reign of terror. But if we look at our government today, are we on the cusp of failure? Do we have an absolutist, monarchic government that's trying to take away all our freedoms? Absolutely not.
Louis XVI took power in 1774 at the age of 15 and married into the royal family of Austria, the Habsburgs, to Marie Antoinette, who was 14. They lived in the Palace of Versailles, 12 miles south of Paris. Louis XVI was a fat, awkward, useless doof. The marriage was a political gesture to symbolize a new allyship of two former rival states, France and Austria. He was considered wholly incompetent to be king, and his bride had very little interest in her political duties as well. Meanwhile, France had been on the decline for the most part of the century. Mismanagement, constant warfare, particularly with its rival Britain, which included the 7 Years' War in 1756 and the financial and military support for the American Revolution, had left France essentially broke. The fact that the wealthy excluded themselves from taxes, combined with the decimation of French agriculture due to bad weather, left French peasants broke, hungry, and eager to kick some doors down. Inspired by the ideas and success of the American Revolution, the French Revolution began with a series of riots and uprisings in 1789. King Louis XVI was spending half of his budget addressing the federal debt. He tried to reform the system under various finance ministers. He even called for democracies on a local level. You're listening to 1360 AM KHNC Freedom Radio.
Welcome back, everybody, to 1360 KHNC Freedom Radio. We are the Liberty Revolt, and we are here with our guest, Kevin, the president of Turning Point USA, and I believe we were talking about the French Revolution.
Yeah, we were. It was, by the way, it's the CSU chapter, Go Rams. And we were just talking about, what it is about these revolutions that lends itself so easily to being taken over. And one of the big things about them is when your revolution does not have leadership, does not have at least some figure who's espousing the values that brought you together and is really holding the following accountable to it, it always ends up bad. So you were talking about the French Revolution earlier, and that led directly into Napoleon. And Napoleon was bad enough as it was, but he doesn't even come close to what happens afterwards. You look at what happened with the Socialist Revolution in Russia. It started off with the Bolshevik Revolution that Lenin ended up becoming the entire face of at the end. And Lenin was not a good person. People hold him up like he was how it should have been, and then Stalin made it worse. No, Lenin taught Stalin. Stalin was Lenin's right-hand man, and he took that over. You look at China, the faceless revolution that started there that ended up being taken by Mao. You look at what happened in Cambodia, what happened in North Korea. And so when you look at all these revolutions, the biggest problem you see, and you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, off the top of your head, who is the leader of the Black Lives Matter movement?
See, I have no idea.
Probably.
Yeah, this is what people think. It's like these faceless revolutions, they come in, this sort of jives with communist philosophy, saying that, we're going to have a worker-driven paradise, everybody's going to be equal, this and that, and then there's always a power vacuum, and someone's always going to step in to fill it, and there are always going to be people who are, purporting these ideas for the perpetuation or the growth of their own power. And the fact that we can actually think we can equalize and level the playing field and have a people's revolution without a leader is contradicted by almost every historical instance.
Well, right. Well, even the French Revolution kind of had a revolutionary figurehead, and that was Maximilien Robespierre.
Yeah.
However, after Louis the 16th was decapitated via guillotine, he was shortly after, under the Committee of Public Safety that guillotined, 16,000 of France's citizens?
Busy guillotine.
Yeah, those guillotines
while they were
Yeah.
bankrupt in the midst of a famine and engaged in something like 9 wars?
Yeah. It was famine is also a really good common theme that you find with it throughout all of these revolutions. Every single one of them. Do you guys know how many people died of starvation last year in America?
I think 0.
I have no idea. They don't keep track of it because less than 10 people die a year of it. Like,
right, we have a problem where our poor people are too fat.
Yeah, our poor people are more likely to die of diseases that royalty used to die of back in the olden days. King Henry VIII was famous for being this fat lard on a horse. And he was seen that way because it was, royalty got to eat while everyone else got to die. And now we're in a situation where food is so abundant that they have to figure out ways to get it to even cheaper. They have to make it even cheaper than it should be. Whereas you hear Bernie Sanders going, breadlines are good, breadlines help everyone.
Well, when we look at China, we can't say that it was all a bad thing.
No, yeah. They got up to really high literacy rates by killing all the illiterates. It makes it really easy to bring your literacy rate up. They also killed a lot of illiterates. So.
Oh, they killed plenty of illiterates. I mean, during the Cultural Revolution, they were hunting teachers, elders, anyone with glasses, basically anyone with an inkling of intellectualism.
Yep.
And, when your revolution is based on stupid premises and you're trying to uphold stupid premises, the best thing you can do is probably kill smart people, I guess.
Yeah, no, and they're still struggling to this day. So just imagine that most of your innovation is going to come from the top 10% of the IQ spectrum in your country. Well, China did their best to rid their country of that top 10%. So when you're going out of your way to kill the people who are going to, 5 years after, when famine is hitting and you're trying to figure out ways to provide water to, really distant parts of your country, well, you just spent the last 10 years killing off all your engineers, killing off all your inventors in your country. How are you going to expect any of this to get solved? So it's crazy how each socialist revolution in the 20th century kind of like upped the ante on the next one. Like, you have Nazi Germany, where their death numbers were from between 6 to 10 million. And then you have the Soviet Union, whose death tolls, it ranges from 20 to 40. Some estimates put it at about 50 million.
Right, but when you're counting in magnitudes of millions, you've kind of made your point.
As Stalin said once, one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. And that is just, because that just nullifies it for a lot of people. You start talking about it, it's like, no. You talk about how capitalism has evils in it, and it's like, you know what, there are things to be said that when capitalist companies use socialist countries to produce their goods, communist countries to produce their goods, there's evil to be found in that.
Like, by the way, a tremendous amount of the masks we're buying up now are being produced by Uyghur slaves in China.
Oh, Apple, Nike, they've all been, they're using those same labor camps at this point right now. And there is evil to be found in that, but that's not an evil brought about by capitalism. If China was a capitalist country wherein everybody made money determined on their own worth and stuff like that, then none of this would happen, because Chinese workers would have the same value as American workers. But the way it is now, that the Chinese people have been put in such, especially the Uyghurs, have been put so low on the social totem pole that their worth in the eyes of a company is like, well, we can get so much more work paying this person $1 a day than we ever could.
Well, it's like modern day serfdom in China.
Yep.
Again, they're basically bringing that back. And the interesting thing is I lived there for 3 years, and the cultural element of it is that this level of work is prized. There's a thing called a 996 in China that Jack Ma, the CEO of Alibaba, was pushing for a while. And that means you should work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, all the time. You should always do that. And, so many people actually take up this model, but the work becomes incredibly inefficient at this point.
Oh, yeah.
So, when you're trading efficiency for human capital and you're putting people in cubicles for this many hours a day, not to mention the factories, like you said, when you're getting paid $1 a day and you move down the social spectrum, it gets worse. You have a situation where social change is basically impossible because people are not only working too hard, but they're expected, they see their cultural figures praising them for basically bending over backwards to this new idea of serfdom.
If you're working 9 hours a day, or from 9 to 9, 6 days a week, like, your body is beat. Your body is broken. It is hard to find the time to be able to organize. And because it's so difficult to find that time to organize, any attempt at organizing is crushed almost immediately. Like, it makes it incredibly easy for the Chinese Communist Party to start crushing down any kind of democratic revolt that might even start. Not to mention that you have companies like Google that have been out like expressly complicit in helping the Chinese government maintain its surveillance state. Let's put it this way, the people who think that Google isn't as bad as, as some of these other companies out there, when Google started, they had in their headquarters it said, "Don't be evil," in big old letters, right at the entrance of their company. That was their main mantra. And, over the last decade, that disappeared. This is a company who has the ability to manipulate elections in other countries and has outwardly said, hey, we got to take that "don't be evil" part down because we're there's obviously something going on here. We're doing some pretty bad things.
Well, at least they're being transparent about it by taking it down.
Yeah.
And you also look at someone like Hunter Biden, who's in business to sell facial recognition technology to members of the Chinese Communist Party, who are then using it on Uyghurs to, throw them in concentration camps. So it goes beyond the companies and into the political realm.
Right. So, the progressives in some way have a point. There are excesses of capitalism. However, the best friend of corrupt capitalism is corrupt big government.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And so there is a balance that we need to strike between expanding government to a point that we can help rein in some of the excesses of the free market, but we also need to be able to rein in the excesses of government, which is a lot harder to do.
Yeah.
Once you create a government program, once you create a government bureaucracy, it's so hard to rein that back in. Ronald Reagan compared them to the closest thing to angels in that they are immortal.
Well, you look at it like this. What makes capitalism successful is when the government realizes its role is not to dictate, it's to facilitate. The national government's job is to facilitate the trade between states. So if one state has an abnormal tax on one thing and the state next to it doesn't, but the state needs to go east. Say Nebraska has this weird tax that Colorado doesn't, which is probably not going to happen because Colorado, is tax heaven right now. The government's job is to make it so that a company who's trying to ship through Colorado does not have to deal with Colorado's, taxes and stuff like that, so long as their whole goal is to just move their trade through it. It's to facilitate. But as soon as you start dictating, no, Colorado, you can't do this, you can't have this tax, you can't do this or that, that's when the government starts actually it's counterproductive because people in the government have no clue what the frick they're doing. Like, I worked in the government for enough time to know that people in the government really don't know what they're doing, right? And to think that it should come from government bureaucracies. Corporations don't even pretend to understand how things are supposed to work. The number one guiding principle of capitalism is every person knows what they want.
Yep, and governments, if you're getting paid the same amount, you're going to get your benefits no matter what. It really does not matter in the lower levels of bureaucracy what sort of institutional change that you push out. You could ride the status quo all the way to the bank for the entirety of your career, get the same benefits, get the same pay, everything. So incentivizing governments to get off their butts and actually do something and change the status quo and quit taking lobbying money, it's almost impossible. And beyond that, no one wants to do it. No one wants to, get off their butt and work for the benefits when they can just be handed them.
Yeah, and the sad part is we in America have probably the most benevolent government around because at the end of the day, government is a necessary evil. It is a tyrant. It is a great tyrant. And you see it all over the place. We struggle to keep it in check here when they set up a very intricate system of checks and balances. Then as soon as you look at countries where it's like, oh, there's not even the slightest. The person at the top has all the power. You end up with Mao, where 70 to 100 million people are dead. You end up with Pol Pot, where 20% of his country's population died. 20%. That's the equivalent of if Mao had had his way, I think it would have been about 150 to 200 million people dead. And it's like, this is what happens when your government is not, when no one's there to say no. This is what happens when the mob is allowed to dictate where the government goes. When the people who have nothing get to finally decide we're going to take everything.
Right. So, while Loser the 16th was spending half of his budget addressing the federal debt, he tried to reform the system under various finance ministers and even called for democracies on a local level. But all attempts to fix it failed, and soon France was basically declared bankrupt. This nicely coincided with 50-something days of cold weather and hailstorms that destroyed a year's crops and caused widespread hunger. Meanwhile, the king certainly did not look broke. He was splurging on fine clothes, food, and hunting trips. Antoinette was indulging in a collection of jewelry and dresses. Enlightenment thinkers like Immanuel Kant were challenging religious thought, such as the divine role of the monarchy. So basically, the peasants were hungry, France was buried in debt, its leadership was incompetent, and the intellectuals were beginning to question the entire political structure. In response to this crisis, Louis XVI called a meeting of the Estates Generals, the closest thing that France had to a nationalist parliament, which hadn't met since 1614. It was broken down into 3 estates. First was the nobles, with about 300 representatives. Second, the clergy, 300 representatives. And thirdly, the peasants, everyone else, 600 representatives. After several votes, everything was deadlocked, so the third estate gathered as a national assembly. Loser rejected this and tried to lock them out of the building, saying, you can't be a national assembly if you can't assemble. Well, it wasn't too difficult to find a different building, so they found an indoor tennis court where they swore the infamous tennis court oath, and they agreed not to give up until a French constitution was established. Louis responded by sending troops to Paris to quell uprising, which reminds me of Portland today.
Yeah, so it's interesting where we're looking at both sides of this, and there is agitation, and I think I was talking about this before, but that peaceful protest will always be more successful than violent mob uprising. Every time.
The uprisings in Paris were largely fueled by famine. There was such a low level of bread, and it became so expensive that it cost almost a month's wages for a regular person to buy a loaf of bread. That was cut 50% with sawdust. So Louis sent in the troops to try to quell the uprisings. The revolutionaries saw this as a provocation, so they seized the Bastille prison, ostensibly to free prisoners, but there was only 7 prisoners. What they were mostly doing was trying to take the guns, which they did. Again, this reminds me of Portland. The riots in Portland have been reinvigorated since the feds went in, and I believe I heard that they overtook a police union headquarters and torched it.
Yeah, they torched the police union headquarters. They assaulted the federal courthouse. They're going after federal land here. They've been putting up so the federal authorities have started fencing off the federal buildings. I keep saying federal, and it almost sounds like a fake word right now. But so the federal authorities there, the only place they really have jurisdiction is on their land. And Portland's mayor has already had the police completely almost stand down.
And disarmed their citizens.
Exactly.
Well, that's the problem. You think that she's completely complicit in getting the feds to come in. It's almost, you can almost orchestrate this as a certain type of conspiracy that, they know that the feds are going to come in if they tell the police to stand down, and the police stand down, and the feds escalate, and there are more protesters, and there's agitation on both sides. Right. No one knows who's right anymore.
And it's interesting because I absolutely hate the idea, as a libertarian, I absolutely hate the idea of federal agents picking people up, doing what they're
anywhere
doing.
Near me.
At the same point, as a father, if I live in a city where the government takes my Second Amendment rights so I can't defend myself, tells the police to stand down, and lets mobs of violent revolutionaries take over and set up autonomous zones with my neighborhood and business inside, where people are being shot and murdered and things are being trashed and businesses are being extorted for protection fees and all of this, at some point, the federal government has a duty to protect those citizens.
Absolutely. And what's crazy is, first off, the only chop chads we ever heard about really was the one that was in Seattle. New York had one that they finally had to shut down. Philadelphia had one. I believe St. Louis had one. They had these all over the place, and they were all similar in that as soon as they kept the police out, everything that you could think would happen happened. I thought it was really funny in the Chaz, the civil rights movement in America, it took, following the end of slavery into Jim Crow, into the civil rights movement, there was so much that had to go into bringing equality to especially black communities, the black people in this country. And then in the Chop Chaz, within 3 days, they had already instituted segregation again. Like, it was, within 3 days, they had blacks-only gardens and all this other kind of stuff. And it was just like, the speed at which this civilized things that we have created, this tearing down of arbitrary boundaries such as skin color, such as gender, that goes to the wayside as soon as you let the mob start to dictate things. And what happens is when you have an oppressed element of people that just feel like, there's nothing that they can really do. They just feel oppressed at the end of the day. Anything is justified. Everything is justified. And we're getting to a point, it's like, it's mostly white liberals. It is the white guilt plague that has hit this country.
Right. And every time the anti-police narrative comes into play and these riots pop off and everything, the police withdraw.
Yeah.
Violent crime in these communities go up. More black individuals are killed.
Oh my God.
And so what really happens, it's a way for white liberals to virtue signal and black communities to pay the price with their lives.
The white liberals aren't on the ground.
Yeah.
The Seattle mayor only got mad about Chaz when protesters started threatening her personal estate.
Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute. I don't want people around here with no police and I can't kick them out and they might come onto my lawn.
Yeah.
Like, this is the perfect white liberal virtue signaling, is living far away in the suburbs and cheering people burning down their own neighborhoods. I mean, how far away from people on the ground can you actually get? You could say you empathize all you want, but if you're cheering these people on to destroy their own communities so future business investments aren't even going to be there, then you're worse than a hypocrite.
Yeah, it's
right. And when the Portland mayor came down to the protests, they shamed him. They were screaming, F you, get the F out of here, F you.
And the feds kicked his butt.
All the media entities, the politicians, and all these people stoking on this movement, they're going to be the first one the alligator eats.
Exactly. And it's like the soft bigotry of low expectation science through, because I mentioned the blacks only gardens, quote unquote, that they had started up. Those were started by white liberals. It's this idea that, like, we have to, I acknowledge my racism and how I've been so superior in society. It's like, do you not see how just horrible that mindset is?
How patronizing and condescending?
I'm constantly told the pull yourself up by the bootstraps mantra doesn't work for everyone. I'm like, yeah, it doesn't work for people that have legitimate mental deficiencies, that have legitimate physical deficiencies. But unless you're going to try to tell me that being black or being Latino or being poor or these other things is cause for why someone is going to be incapable of overcoming the great tragedies that have befallen them, like, to me it's just heartbreaking. You absolutely cannot go to any person on the street and just ask them about their lives and not have them tell you about something that has happened tragically in their lives.
Right, and we used to have social institutions that took care of people that actually did this. And it wasn't the government that sucks at it. It was institutions that were actually pretty good at it, like the church, like the Father.
Yeah.
And even the community. If you think about, the dissolution of community in America has really eviscerated any sense of sort of togetherness that we have with our neighbors, that we have with the people around us who ostensibly are more similar to us than anyone else in any other city, right? Your neighbors who are right next to you. But you probably don't know them while you're cheering on the riots in another city. So it's like you have the evisceration of the family, of the community, of all these values, and then you need somewhere to put your virtue. People who think they're oppressed need someone to blame, and personal responsibility, one of the founding values that made America great to begin with, falls by the wayside until we're begging for someone else to come in and fix things for us.
Yep. And the entire Democratic platform, the entire leftist platform is, what can we do to make sure that you do not have to live with the consequences of your actions? Like, first and foremost, school. Oh, let's get rid of your school debt. You know who's not asking for their school debt to be removed? Are people that know that they're going to be able to pay it off because the job they got with the degree they got, the degree was worth it. So lawyers don't care, because for the most part, unless you're just a really bad lawyer who shouldn't have gone into it in the first place, you're going to pay off your student debt.
Right. And in some capacity, I do think we should subsidize education, because it is in our national interest to have a well-educated population. However, it shouldn't be, we're going to tax every working person so that pothead Joe can drop out of gender studies 6 times.
Yeah.
Right? It needs to be something that's sustainable, that's actually beneficial. That's not in these liberal arts that are just sowing so much division disintegrationist philosophy.
Hey, now I'm a liberal arts major.
Hey, I was a liberal arts major.
No, but you're right. Like, it's like, hey, oh, you want to go into engineering, but you can't afford college here. We'll help you do that. 'Cause
And
we need
you've
engineers.
shown that you can actually pay attention in school and pass your classes and make something of it. Right, it should be based on merit, and it should be based on the educational needs of our society. You're listening to 1360 AM KHNC Freedom Radio.
LibertyRevoltMedia.com.
So we were talking about the revolution in France. The really big move came when the National Assembly convened on August 4th and abolished most of the ancien regime. Feudal rights, tithes, privileges for nobles, unequal taxation were all abolished in the name of writing a new constitution. And then on August 26th, the National Assembly proclaims the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which laid out a system of rights and made those rights integral to the new Constitution. It declared that everyone had the right to liberty, property, and security. Meanwhile, back in Versailles, Louis XVI was still King of France, and it was looking like France might be a constitutional monarchy, which might have meant the royal family could hang on to their awesome house. But a rumor started that Marie Antoinette was hoarding grain in the palace, and in what became known as the Woman's March, not the Pussy Hat March, a bunch of armed peasant women stormed the palace and demanded that the king and queen move back to Paris, which they did, escorted by a mob who had decapitated royal guards and paraded their heads around on pikes the entire 12-mile journey. This was a nice reminder that to many people at the time, the French Revolution was not about fancy Enlightenment ideas, but was mostly about civil unrest and famine and an economically displaced underclass. The National Assembly wanted to create a constitutional monarchy. They believed that the king was necessary for a stable society and had deliberated that the voters and office holders should be exclusively men of property. Only the most radical wing, the Jacobins, called for the creation of a republic. But things were about to get much more revolutionary and worse for France. First, the Jacobins had a petition drive that got a bit unruly, which led to troops being controlled not by the king, but by the National Assembly to fire on the crowd, killing 50 people. And that meant that the National Assembly, which was the revolutionary voice, had killed people in an attempt to rein in the revolutionary fervor. This is a tendency among loosely planned revolutions. They succumb to the radical elements and get carried away with themselves easily and begin eating themselves and spiraling into an authoritarian circular firing squad. Meanwhile, France's monarchical neighbors were getting nervous about all this, especially Leopold II, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, who wasn't holy, wasn't necessarily Roman or really an emperor, but he was Marie Antoinette's brother. At this point, the Roman Empire was basically just Austria. And like most monarchs, he liked the idea of preserving the monarchy. So he and King William Frederick II of Prussia issued a declaration of Pillnitz, which intended to restore the French monarchy. At this point, Louis and the National Assembly decided to invade Austria. The idea was to plunder its wealth and steal the grain, and to bring about revolutionary fervor there. But what actually happened is that Prussia joined Austria in fighting the French, and then Louis encouraged the Prussians, which made him look like an enemy of the revolution, of which of course he was, and the result, National Assembly voted to suspend the monarchy, have new elections in which men could vote, and create a new republican constitution. Soon this convention decided to have a trial on Louis, and he was sentenced to die by the new egalitarian death machine, the guillotine, which made it difficult for Prussia and Austria to restore him to the throne. The death of Louis XVI marked the beginning of the Terror, which is the best known phase of the revolution. After killing the king, nobody was off limits. The Terror saw the guillotining of 16,000, quote, enemies of the revolution, which they did under the Committee of Public Safety. Motto, we suck at protecting public safety.
Yeah, so I think anytime when you say even the king is not off limits to the guillotine and that we are going to get rid of any enemies of the state, that is the point where the revolution spirals out of control.
Exactly.
And you see that in China, you see that in Cambodia, you see that in so many countries with revolutions. At this point, there's no reining it back in.
Yep. And you actually starting to see it now. So, Karl Marx, he actually took a lot of his influence from what happened in the French Revolution, everything like that. But more importantly, the king, right? When you think of that in the American sense, it's George Washington, it's Thomas Jefferson, it's, Abraham Lincoln. They're not kings in the same sense, but these are men that we hold in esteem as they were the ones that really lived the values that is supposed to keep America going. George Washington was almost anointed our king and said no.
He said no.
Yeah,
he pushed the power away.
He pushed it away. And so as soon as the left, as soon as, the BLM organization, again, not the actual people out there protesting and making it this point, the actual organization, as soon as they make it okay to tear down the statue of George Washington, to tear down the statue of Thomas Jefferson, there is no one left. They have created a standard wherein perfection is the only thing that is allowed to be praised, except the problem with that is nobody is perfect. There has never been a perfect person except for Jesus. And whether or not you believe in Jesus, the point still stands. If your model is only perfect people can be looked up to, then you're never going to have anyone to look up to. But they don't care about that. Their whole goal is to just make it so we can't look up to anyone. The values espoused by Jefferson and Washington don't matter anymore because they did this.
They want to tear down society and accumulate power. That's all they want. That's all they're going to do. And the oppressed people that they're having carry on this revolution on their behalf are going to be destroyed by it.
Yeah.
They're just being used as cannon fodder.
You're seeing it now. Like Bill de Blasio's New York, where the police stand down. Only black people have been shot since the police stood down.
Oh, absolutely.
Only black people. Only black people have been getting killed in these communities. And you want to tell me Black Lives Matter? How about the fact that you are having, in Chicago, you can look at any year. I'll use the year 2015 here. I think it was 3,500 people total were shot. Only 23 shootings involved police. 9 resulted in death. Out of 3,500, and that's where everything's made. You can say racism is a problem, and I'm not saying it's not. But at the end of the day, we exist in a society where it isn't the biggest problem.
Well, this stuff isn't gonna work. Okay, let's take Virginia for an example. Virginia recently flipped to a blue state.
Yeah.
But Virginia is 51st in the nation for almost everything.
www.libertyrevoltmedia.com, 1360 AM, KHNC, Freedom Radio.
So, before we left, we were talking about how these sort of BLM motives are counterproductive. And I think one way to look at this is Virginia, which is a recently turned blue state, and yet is 51st in the nation for minimum wage and other social programs. The minimum wage in Virginia is $7.25 an hour. Okay? But the Virginia governor, who's blue, and the legislature and everything else said, oh, well, we can take down some statues, and we can change the names of some courthouses, and here are the concessions we're giving to you guys. Do you guys think this is going to solve the problem that these people are out in the streets protesting for in the beginning? And this is by focusing on something like taking down statues. When this becomes the locus of your revolutionary idea, then you've certainly lost the thread of why you were protesting in the first place.
Cool. You're asking if the man who didn't know if he was the KKK guy or the blackface guy, if he would know how policy can be effective. By the way, everyone, that is Ralph Northam, who does not know if he was KKK or blackface and somehow did not get canceled. Still is somehow the Democratic governor of Virginia.
Well, because he's a Democrat. He's got a D next to his name.
But that is exactly the whole entire point. The rules for thee, but not for me mantra that goes through this whole movement. And it's just so destructive. I'm sorry, but when you have schools where 3% of the kids graduating are graduating able to do math or read at grade level, at high school level, the problem isn't the police in that situation. The problem isn't all these other stuff. It's the fact that you have these institutions that are broken. These are institutions wherein the competition that made everything so great, that makes America great, that makes our colleges the best colleges on the planet, the same education competition is not to be found when you're looking down at your public school level. The same kind of competition is not going to be found when you're looking at your healthcare field. And people are wondering why we're having so many of these issues. It's like, because at the end of the day, when you're turning towards the government for your solutions because you think that they're going to solve your problems, look, there is no incentive for government to actually solve your problems. If there's a bureaucracy created to identify and address a certain issue, the people in that bureaucracy are not incentivized to solve it because then they lose their job. There is no incentive for anyone to solve problems, and that's the whole thing. If you took the Democratic narrative, if you took the Democratic platform and solved all the issues on it,
right. How often have government agencies that are supposed to be responsible for addressing problems hidden things that were relevant to the situation so that they could continue to empower themselves? And there's so many things where it's like the solution is always just give us more money.
Give us more money, give
right?
us more power. Yeah.
Like, do you think climate scientists are about to come out and say, well, no, I don't think there's that much we can do about it. No, they're going to come out and say, we need another $100 billion check or the world's going to end.
Yeah, there's this new thing that's really going to tear us down here. It's like,
and that's not to say that there isn't a legitimate role for us to look into these problems. There absolutely is. But is government always the solution? And when government is the solution, it never ends.
Well, the problem is that people don't understand what government actually is. Government is the entity whose gun barrel can actually pull the trigger. Government is the person who, on the other end of it, they are legally allowed to shoot you should you resist.
Behind every tax, behind every regulation, behind every law is a government agent with a gun.
Yeah.
If you disobey that law, and then you refuse to pay the fine, and then you refuse to submit to arrest,
yeah,
they'll point a gun at you.
There is an absolutely plausible situation wherein I go 2 miles and over and get pulled over for it and end up dying for it.
Thank you for listening to The Liberty Revolt, www.libertyrevoltmedia.com, facebook.com/Liberty Revolt Media. You're listening to 1360 AM KHNC, Freedom Radio.
Thank you everyone for letting me come here and guest host. Catch me on Common Nonsense with me and my partner Kobe. Common Nonsense with Kevin and Kobe. We do our podcast every once in a while when it's convenient for us. But for reals, we're actually trying to come out with a more standard schedule. That's KOMMON, Nonsense with Kevin and Kobe on all.